The deed hit the table with a sound like a gunshot. Helen Carver stared at it, her breath caught somewhere between her ribs and her throat, her fingers hovering over the edge of the paper as if touching it might make the whole impossible moment dissolve into dust. The afternoon sun burned through the window of the McCrae ranch house, throwing long amber bars across the worn pine floor, and in that golden light she could read every word of the document clearly. Her name. Her name written in Abel McCrae's own firm, deliberate hand, beside his, on a deed of ownership, half the Double M Ranch. Abel stood on the other side of the table, his hat in his hands, his jaw set in that familiar granite line she had spent 7 months learning to read. He was not a man who flinched. He was not a man who explained himself twice or begged for understanding. He was the most infuriatingly closed, impossibly proud, devastatingly private man she had ever encountered in her 26 years of living, and right now he was watching her face with an intensity that made her feel like she was standing at the edge of a canyon with no clear bottom. "I don't understand," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "Yes, you do." His voice was low, rough as gravel and just as certain. "Abel." She finally touched the deed. The paper was real. The ink was dry. This was not a draft or a proposal. This had already been filed at the county courthouse in Millhaven. She could see the registrar's stamp in the corner. "You signed this 3 days ago." "I did, without asking me." "You earned it." He said the words the way a man might say something he had been holding in for a very long time, releasing them carefully, watching them land. "You earned every acre of it, Helen. I'm not asking you to argue with me about that." She looked up at him. She had known this man through drought and debt, through a range war that nearly swallowed them both, through his silences that could fill a room like smoke and his rare moments of warmth that were more devastating than any anger. She had worked beside him, bled beside him in the figurative sense, and somewhere in the middle of all that hard living she had made the terrible mistake of falling in love with him. And now he was giving her half his land, without asking, and calling it earned. The tears came without her permission, which made her furious, and she turned away from the table so he would not see them. What he did not know, what he could not possibly know yet, was that she had been planning to leave. Her bag was already packed upstairs. 7 months earlier, the territory of Colorado had been trying to make up its mind about what kind of place it wanted to be. The year was 1882, and the cattle boom that had turned men like Abel McCrae into serious landowners was beginning to show its first long shadows. Prices were still holding, but the whispers about overgrazing, about the coming of barbed wire, about Eastern money moving west to squeeze out the small ranchers, those whispers had started threading through every conversation at every saloon and general store from Millhaven to the county line. Helen Carver had arrived in Millhaven on the afternoon stage from Denver, which was itself a considerable journey from Cincinnati, where she had spent the first 26 years of her life working as a bookkeeper for a commercial dry goods firm owned by a man named Hargrove who paid her half what he paid the men who did half the work she did. She had not come west looking for romance. She had come west looking for work that paid fair wages and for air that did not smell like coal smoke and Hargrove's pipe tobacco. The position she had answered in the Denver newspaper had been direct and businesslike, which suited her temperament precisely. Needed a capable woman with knowledge of accounts and correspondence to manage the books and administrative affairs of a working cattle ranch. Fair wages, room and board provided. Apply to the Double M Ranch, Millhaven, Colorado. References required. It had not mentioned that the rancher in question was 33 years old, broad-shouldered, and possessed of gray eyes so particular in their watchfulness that the first time Helen met them, she had felt a small, treacherous shift somewhere in the center of her chest that she had firmly categorized as the effect of altitude and promptly tried to forget. The man who had met her stage was not Abel himself but his foreman, a good-natured Texan named Rufus Bland who had the face of a bloodhound and the manners of a deacon. Rufus had loaded her trunk onto the wagon without asking if she needed help, which she appreciated, and had driven her the 6 miles out to the Double M in a comfortable silence, broken only by his occasional and completely sincere observations about the quality of the afternoon sky. Abel McCrae had been mending a section of fence along the south pasture when they arrived. He had come in from the field still wearing his work gloves and the particular layer of honest dust that accumulated on a man who did not consider himself too important to work alongside his hands. He had shaken Helen's hand once firmly, looked at her in that measuring way that she would come to understand was not rudeness but simply the way he processed information, and said, "Your references were good. You'll start Monday. Rufus will show you the house." That was it. No welcome speech. No tour of the operation. No polite small talk about her journey or the weather. Helen had stood in the yard watching him walk back toward the fence line and had thought, with absolute clarity, this man is going to be very difficult to work for. She had been both right and wrong about that. The Double M house was larger than she had expected and considerably better maintained. Abel McCrae was, she discovered quickly, a man of fierce practical order. His ledgers, when she first opened them, were not a disaster as she had half expected, but were instead maintained with a kind of stubborn regularity that spoke of a man who understood the value of knowing exactly where he stood. What they lacked was finesse. He recorded income and outgoing with a rancher's directness, but missed the subtler tools that a trained bookkeeper understood: the depreciation tables, the advance planning columns, the correspondence systems that could smooth relationships with buyers and creditors alike. Within her first 2 weeks, Helen had reorganized his accounts payable system, established a monthly reporting format that gave Abel a clear picture of cash position at any given moment, and begun drafting more effective correspondence to the 3 Denver-based cattle buyers the Double M relied on. Abel had looked at her revised ledger system on the Friday of that second week, stood over it for a full 3 minutes without speaking, and then said, "Where did you learn this?" "8 years of doing it," she said. He had looked at her with that measuring expression again, and this time she had noticed that underneath the calculation there was something else, something that looked almost like respect, and it had done that treacherous shifting thing to her chest again. She had ignored it very deliberately and gone back to her correspondence. The first real crisis came in her 5th week. Abel had a shipment of 40 head contracted to a buyer named Colfax in Denver, and 2 days before the drive was scheduled to begin, a letter arrived from Colfax's office indicating that the price per head had been renegotiated downward by 12% due to, as the letter elegantly put it, market fluctuations and changing demand. 12% represented the difference between a profitable quarter and a barely breaking-even quarter, for the Double M. Abel had read the letter at the breakfast table and put it down with the controlled stillness of a man who was very angry and was not going to show it to anyone. Helen, who had been reviewing payroll figures across the table, had watched him in her peripheral vision. She said nothing. She finished her column. Then she set down her pen. "May I read that?" she asked. He pushed it across the table without comment. She read it twice. The second time she was reading not for content but for the specific legal language of the original contract, which Colfax's lawyer had been very careful to frame in ways that looked binding, but actually contained enough ambiguity to be challenged. She had seen this kind of letter before. Hargrove's firm had occasionally sent similar ones to their own suppliers. "He can't actually do this," she said. Abel looked at her. The original contract specified the per-head price in terms of the market rate as established at the Denver stockyard on the date of agreement, not the date of delivery. The market rate on the day you signed was actually $2 higher than what they're trying to pay you now. They're hoping you won't notice the difference between those 2 clauses. A long silence. "You're certain?" he said. "I would like to draft a response before I am entirely certain," she said carefully. "But yes. I think Colfax is attempting to use contract language he believes a rancher won't parse carefully enough to challenge." Abel was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "Draft the response." She spent 4 hours on that letter. She was precise where precision served her, and deliberately warm in tone, where warmth might soften the firmness of the legal argument. She cited the specific clause. She attached a copy of the original agreement with the relevant section marked. She thanked Colfax for his continued business relationship with the Double M, and expressed her confidence that this was simply an oversight that a man of his business standing would naturally wish to correct. Colfax paid the original contract price, in full, with a brief and slightly stiff note acknowledging the oversight. Abel read Colfax's reply at the breakfast table the same way he had read the original letter, with absolute stillness. Then he folded it and put it in his vest pocket and looked at Helen. "Thank you," he said. 2 words. From Abel McCrae she was beginning to understand. 2 words like that carried the weight of a speech. October brought the first frost, and with it a problem that was larger and darker than a contract dispute. The McCrae ranch shared a northern boundary with a man named Doyle Harwick, who had arrived in the valley 3 years before Abel, and whose method of expanding his holdings had always been the kind that polite people described as aggressive and honest people described as predatory. Harwick had been systematically buying out smaller ranchers along the Millhaven Creek watershed, and the Double M sat on the last significant stretch of creek-adjacent grazing land that he did not control. The water rights attached to that land were, in dry years, the difference between a successful operation and a failed one. Helen became aware of the Harwick problem gradually, the way you become aware of a smell in a house, first as something at the edge of your senses, and then as something impossible to ignore. She noticed it first in Abel's correspondence, in letters from neighboring ranchers that had a quality of subdued alarm in them, and then in the way Abel's jaw tightened slightly whenever Harwick's name came up in conversation, and then in a visit from the county land agent, a nervous man named Pruitt, who arrived on a Tuesday afternoon and spent 40 minutes in Abel's study with the door closed. After Pruitt left, Abel came into the office where Helen worked and stood in the doorway for a moment. She looked up. "Harwick has filed a competing water rights claim on Millhaven Creek," he said. "He's arguing that the original survey that established my water access was inaccurate and that his property line extends further than recorded." Helen set down her pen. "Does it?" "No," the word was flat and absolute. "The survey was done by the Territorial Office in 1877. I was there. I watched every stake go into the ground." "Do you have the survey documents?" A pause. "They're in Denver, in the Territorial Land Office records." Helen was already thinking, "Can you get copies?" "It would take time. Pruitt says Harwick's lawyers have already petitioned the district court." "There will be a hearing in 6 weeks." 6 weeks. She looked at the calendar on her desk. She looked at the stacked correspondence files. She looked at Abel McCrae standing in the doorway of her office with that controlled, furious stillness of his and felt something that was not purely professional concern move through her. "Let me help," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "This is beyond bookkeeping." "I'm aware." She met his gaze steadily. "Let me help anyway." The 6 weeks that followed were the most intense of Helen's professional life. She wrote to Denver, to 2 different offices, requesting certified copies of the 1877 survey. She researched territorial water law, sending for specific texts from the Denver City Library, which arrived in a crate on the Wednesday stage 2 weeks into her campaign. She cross-referenced the survey boundaries with every piece of documented evidence she could find in the Double M records, old fence logs, grazing records, correspondence with neighboring ranchers that mentioned shared landmarks. She also, because she was thorough, and because something about Harwick's confidence unsettled her, began looking more carefully at his own documented history in the valley. What she found there was not illegal exactly, but it was a pattern, a dark, deliberate pattern of paperwork manipulation. In 2 of the previous sales he had completed, there were discrepancies in the recorded survey dates that, if someone had been paying attention, might have suggested the surveys had been conducted after rather than before certain boundary-relevant events. It was not proof of fraud, but it was a shape. She presented everything she had found to Abel on a Sunday evening, laying it out on the dining table with the methodical precision she brought to everything. He sat across from her and listened without interrupting, which she had learned was his way of paying complete attention. When she finished, he said, "You've been working on this for 3 weeks." "Yes." "At night after your regular work is done." She had not thought he had noticed. "Yes." He was quiet for a long moment, looking at the documents spread between them. Then he said, "You didn't have to do this." "No," she agreed, "but it seemed important." Another silence. A different quality of silence from the one she had grown accustomed to. This one had something searching in it. "Why?" he asked. It was a simple question, and she did not have a simple answer. Or rather, she had an answer she was not prepared to examine, so she said what was also true. "Because what Harwick is doing is wrong. And because the double M is a good operation run by a man who built it honestly, and it seems unfair that dishonesty should defeat it." He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly comfortable. "All right," he said finally. "Let's take this to the hearing." The hearing in Millhaven Circuit Courthouse was the kind of event that drew a crowd in a small territory town, because everyone understood what was at stake. Harwick arrived with 2 lawyers from Denver, and the kind of expensive suit that was meant to signal that the outcome was already settled. Abel arrived with Helen, her documents, and Rufus Bland as a character witness. Helen was not a lawyer and could not argue the case herself, but she had organized every piece of evidence with the precision of someone who had spent 8 years making order out of chaos, and the local man Abel had retained to present the case, a capable if somewhat rumpled attorney named Elias Foote, had spent 2 evenings with Helen going over every document until he understood the argument as clearly as she did. The survey copies from Denver had arrived 4 days before the hearing. They confirmed everything Abel had said. The 1877 boundaries were exactly as recorded, but what turned the hearing was the pattern Helen had found in Harwick's history. Elias Foote presented it carefully, not as an accusation of fraud but as a question of consistency, asking the court to consider whether a man whose previous transactions showed a recurring pattern of boundary ambiguities should be given the benefit of the doubt in yet another disputed survey situation. The judge, a careful man named Aldous Crane who had been presiding over territorial land disputes for 11 years, took 2 days to deliver his decision. He ruled in Abel's favor. Entirely. He also, in a passage of his written decision that made Helen feel a complicated mix of satisfaction and vindication, noted that the pattern of discrepancies in Harwick's historical transactions warranted referral to the Territorial Land Commission for review. Abel received the decision in his office with Helen present. He read it once. He set it on his desk. He looked at Helen. "You did that," he said. "Elias Foote argued it. You built it, every piece of it." His voice was quiet and direct. "Every document, every cross-reference, every pattern you found, that was you." Helen felt warmth rise in her face, which she managed to mostly conceal by looking down at the papers on her own desk. "It was a team effort," she said, "which was professional and true, and not the whole truth. The whole truth was that she had worked those nights in the ranch house lamplight with something that had nothing to do with professional duty, and everything to do with the specific, unacceptable feeling of not wanting to see Abel McCrae lose something he had built with his hands and his integrity and his years. She had recognized that feeling for what it was sometime around the 3rd week of the water rights battle, in the middle of a November night with the wind coming off the mountains, and the fire burning low in the office grate, and the sound of Abel's boots on the floor above her as he moved through the house. She had recognized it and done what she always did with feelings that were inconvenient. She had set them firmly aside and gone back to work. The winter of 1882 into 1883 settled over the double M like a held breath. The crisis had passed, the records were in order, the legal threat was neutralized, and Helen found herself in the strange position of having a daily work life that was satisfying and purposeful, and a heart situation that was quietly, persistently terrible. Abel was not a man who made things easy. He was present in a way that was impossible to ignore, the kind of physical presence that filled a room not through volume or drama, but through sheer solidity. And he had the maddening quality of watching her sometimes with those gray eyes in a way that made her feel simultaneously seen and uncertain. He was not cold, exactly. He was self-contained in the way of someone who had learned that showing yourself completely was a vulnerability that life would eventually use against you. She had come to understand that he had built the double M largely alone, that his parents were both gone, that he had no siblings, that the land was the one thing he had committed to fully and completely. She did not know yet about Catherine. She learned about Catherine in February, in the way that you learn about the hardest things, not all at once but in pieces. Rufus mentioned a name once in passing, and then Abel's housekeeper, an older woman named Bertie who came in 3 days a week, said something oblique about the difficulty of the years before Helen had arrived. And then one afternoon Helen was filing in the study and found, tucked in the back of a lower drawer, a photograph. The woman in the photograph was beautiful in an open, immediate way, dark-haired and smiling, and on the back in faded pencil someone had written simply, Catherine, 1879. Helen put the photograph back where she had found it and did not mention it, but she thought about it. She thought about it quite a lot. And she began to notice other things, the particular way Abel's expression closed sometimes when he was alone and thought no one was watching, the absence of any personal conversation that reached past the surface of things, the way he ran the ranch with a ferocity that suggested a man who had replaced loss with purpose. She asked Rufus eventually, carefully, in the way of someone asking about weather rather than wounds. Rufus was quiet for a long moment. Then he said she was going to marry him. Things went wrong. He looked out at the pasture. Some stories aren't mine to tell, Helen understood. She did not ask again. But she thought about what it meant, loving someone who had learned to protect himself so completely that even his grief was private. She thought about what it would take to reach through that. She thought about whether she was even the kind of woman who had that in her. And then she thought about the careful way Abel had said thank you after the Colfax letter, and the way he had sat across the table from her 3 weeks' worth of documents spread between them and said you did that. And the way he sometimes came to stand in the doorway of her office in the evenings, not because there was business to discuss, but apparently because, for reasons he did not articulate, he wanted to be where she was. She thought about all of that and came to the conclusion that she was in considerable trouble. March came in hard, the way it often did in the Colorado mountains, with a late snow that lasted 4 days and kept the ranch hands close to the bunkhouse and the cattle bunched against the southern fence lines. Abel and 2 of the men had to go out on the 2nd day of the storm to break ice on the water tanks, and Helen spent the afternoon at her desk, watching the snow come sideways past the window and being irrationally anxious in a way she categorized firmly as concern for the ranch operations personnel. When Abel came back in at dusk, snow-coated and sharp-cheeked from the cold, he stopped in the office doorway and she looked up from the payroll ledger she had not really been reading and their eyes met across the room. It lasted only a moment, but it was the kind of moment that changes the weather of things. He said, "Ice is broken. Everyone's accounted for." She said, "Good. There's coffee." And he came in and sat down in the chair across from her desk, with his big hands wrapped around the mug she brought him. And they talked for an hour about nothing important, about the cattle market and the spring schedule, and a letter from a neighboring rancher about a shared fence repair. And it was the most ordinary conversation imaginable, and it was also the best hour Helen Carver had spent in years. April brought mud and calving season and 17-hour days for everyone on the double M, and Helen found herself doing things that had not been in her job description, keeping track of which cows had birthed, which calves needed supplemental feeding, which sections of fence needed priority repair as the ground thawed. She did it not because anyone asked her, but because the operation needed it, and she was there, and she was capable. Abel noticed. He noticed everything. She had come to understand in that quiet, comprehensive way of his. He said nothing directly, but she caught him watching her one afternoon as she tallied calf counts with one of the younger ranch hands, and the expression on his face was one she could not quite read, something between surprise and something softer. The first time he touched her was entirely accidental and entirely devastating. They were both reaching for the same ledger in the filing cabinet in late April, and his hand closed over hers on the spine of the book, and neither of them moved for exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds was long enough. He pulled his hand back. She pulled the ledger out. They were both very professional and perfectly normal for the rest of the afternoon. That night Helen sat in her room and had a direct and unflinching conversation with herself about the situation she was in. She had come west for independence, for work that paid fairly and meant something. She had not come to fall in love with her employer, which was a cliché she found genuinely embarrassing, and she had not come to add a broken heart to her list of reasons to be irritated at the world. Abel McCrae had a dark past wound around a woman named Catherine. He was a man who expressed himself in gestures rather than words, and whose walls were high enough to cast serious shade. He was her employer. He had given no indication beyond a few loaded silences and one accidental moment of hand contact that he saw her as anything other than an unusually competent professional. She decided she would be very careful. She would continue to do her job excellently. She would not make anything complicated. She was very sincere about this decision. It lasted approximately 2 weeks before Harwick came back, not with lawyers this time, with something worse. Doyle Harwick appeared at the Double M on a Thursday afternoon in May, riding up the lane with 2 men behind him, and when Abel came out to meet him, Harwick was smiling in the way of a man who had been thinking about something for a long time and had arrived at a plan he found satisfying. "McCrae," he said, "thought it was time for a conversation between neighbors." "We've had our conversations," Abel said. Helen had come to the porch. Harwick's eyes moved to her, and something in his look made her feel the particular discomfort of being assessed by a man who had already decided what you were worth to him. "Your woman's good with paperwork," Harwick said. "I'll give her that. But paper decisions can be revisited." Abel's voice went very quiet. "What do you want, Harwick?" Harwick's smile didn't change. "I want to offer you a fair price for the northern sections, the creekside parcels, very fair price. Better than you'd get if things went badly for this operation." The implied threat was elegant in its indirection. Helen's mind was already moving, calculating, thinking about what things going badly might mean and what forms it might take. "I'm not selling," Abel said. "You might want to think on that." "I've thought on it." Abel's voice had a finality in it that even Harwick's confidence seemed to register. "Get off my land." Harwick looked at him for a moment, then at Helen, and then he turned his horse and rode back down the lane with his 2 men behind him. Abel stood in the yard watching until they were out of sight. Then he turned and looked at Helen on the porch. "He's not done," she said. "No," Abel agreed. "He's not." They were right. The next 3 weeks brought a series of small miseries. A section of fence on the northern boundary was found cut, not dramatically but neatly, professionally in the night. One of the Double M's water tanks was fouled with debris that looked accidental but wasn't. A rumor appeared in Millhaven that the Double M was in financial difficulty, the kind of rumor that could affect credit terms with suppliers and confidence among cattle buyers. Helen fought the rumor the same way she fought everything, with documented evidence. She prepared a clear financial summary of the Double M's position, and with Abel's knowledge and approval, shared it quietly but directly with the relevant parties: the bank in Millhaven, the key suppliers, the 2 most important buyers. The rumor died because there was no truth in it to sustain it. The fence cuts and the water tank were harder. Those required vigilance and people, and Abel organized night watches along the northern boundary with Rufus and the senior ranch hands, losing sleep to protect what he had built. Helen was not sleeping easily either. She was spending her evenings not on the accounts, but on a deeper project she had not yet told Abel about. She had written, on her own initiative, to the Territorial Land Commission that Judge Crane had referred Harwick's history to, providing a more detailed documentation of the pattern she had identified. She had written carefully, factually, without accusation, letting the documented timeline speak. She had also, through the contacts she had developed during the water rights case, made quiet inquiries about Harwick's financial situation. What came back surprised even her. Harwick was significantly over-leveraged. His expansion had been funded partly by borrowed money, and the timing of the Land Commission investigation could not have been worse for him. He needed the Double M acquisition because without it, his own credit structure was in danger of collapse. He was not acting from a position of strength. He was acting from desperation. She told Abel this on a Wednesday evening in June, sitting across from him at the dining table with her notes between them. Abel was quiet for a long time after she finished. "You've been doing this on your own time," he said. "Yes." "For weeks." "Yes." "Why didn't you tell me?" She considered the question honestly. "Because I wasn't certain enough to raise your hopes and because I didn't want to add to your concerns until I had something solid." He looked at her across the table. The June evening was warm and the windows were open, and the sounds of the ranch at rest came in with the air. The distant low of cattle, the creak of a weather vane, the particular quiet of a working place at the end of a working day. "You protect this ranch," he said, "like it belongs to you." The words hit her with an impact she had not expected. She looked down at her notes. "I care about it," she said quietly. "Helen," she looked up. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen from him before, not the measuring look, not the control distance look. Something open and serious and a little raw, the look of a man who had been protecting himself for a long time and was standing on the edge of a decision about whether to keep doing it. "I should tell you something," he said. "About Catherine." She was still. "You don't have to. I know I don't have to." His voice was even. "I want to," he told her. He told it the way he did everything, without excess, without drama, but with an honesty that was more moving than sentiment would have been. Catherine Doyle had been from a ranch family 2 valleys over. They had been engaged in 1879. In the fall of that year, before the wedding, she had told him that she had accepted a position in Denver, that she wanted a life that was not defined by cattle seasons and isolation, and that she was sorry but she was going. She had gone. Abel had not chased her. He had not written letters or made scenes. He had done what he did with everything that was too large to process. He had worked. He had expanded the Double M, negotiated new water rights, built the South Barn, run the operation harder and tighter until the work was so total that it filled every space where feeling might have lived. "I told myself that was enough," he said. "For a long time I believed it." Silence. Helen said carefully, "And now," he looked at her steadily, "now I'm less certain." The admission was small in its words and enormous in everything else, coming from a man who did not make admissions. Helen felt something shift in her chest, not the small treacherous shift of the early months, but something larger and more irreversible. "Abel," she said. "I'm not asking you for anything," he said quickly, and the slight roughness in his voice was the most vulnerable she had ever heard him. "I just wanted you to know, because you've been honest with me about everything else." She looked at him across the table in the warm June evening with the sounds of the ranch coming through the windows and said, "I came here because I wanted work that meant something. I found that. But I also found something I wasn't looking for, and I've been very careful not to be foolish about it. But you should probably know that my feelings for this ranch are somewhat entangled with my feelings for the man who built it." The silence after that was the most charged she had ever sat in. Then Abel McCrae, who was not a man of easy gestures or impulsive actions, stood up from the table and walked around it and put his hand very gently against her cheek, and Helen covered his hand with hers, and they stayed like that for a moment that was simple and enormous and completely without words. He kissed her later, in the way of someone who had been thinking about it carefully and had decided to stop thinking and simply do it. It was not a hasty kiss or a dramatic one. It was the kind that a serious man gives when he means it completely. And when it was done, Helen put her forehead against his shoulder and he put his arms around her, and they stood in the lamplit dining room of the Double M Ranch house while the summer night settled in around them. Outside, somewhere in the dark of the north pasture, Harwick's troubles were already moving toward their resolution. But inside, two people who had each learned separately to be careful with themselves were discovering that there was a specific, irreplaceable difference between being careful and being alone. The weeks that followed were complicated in the best possible way. The ranch continued to demand everything from both of them, and the practical rhythm of their days did not change dramatically. There was still calving follow-up and account management, and the ongoing vigilance required by Harwick's continued harassment of the northern boundary. But there was a new quality to the space between them, something that had been resolved into acknowledgement, a warmth that moved through the ordinary work of days like heat through stone. Abel was not transformed by love into a different man. He was still quiet and direct, and occasionally so self-contained that Helen wanted to take him firmly by the shoulders and ask him to simply say the word. But he was different with her in small ways that she found more meaningful than any declaration. He came to find her in the evenings not just to stand in her doorway but to sit beside her. He asked her opinion on decisions that were not in her professional remit because he genuinely wanted it. He told her things, not everything, not all at once, but in the way of a man who had decided that someone was worth the vulnerability of being known. She told him things too, about Cincinnati, about Hargrove's firm, and the particular and grinding frustration of being excellent at something and watching men, who were less excellent, be valued more. About her parents, both gone by the time she was 22, her father to a bad winter and her mother to grief that followed too closely behind it. About the loneliness of being capable and alone in a world that was not always kind to women who preferred capability to performance. He listened with his full, complete attention, in the way she had noticed from the beginning, and what she had once read as calculation she now understood was something much simpler. He cared. He just did not perform caring. He felt it and showed it in concrete, reliable ways that a person could actually count on. She understood with complete clarity, deeply in love with him. This was terrifying and wonderful, and she had fully stopped pretending otherwise. July brought the resolution of the Harwick situation in a way that was more dramatic than Helen had anticipated. The Territorial Land Commission's review, informed by Helen's detailed documentation, had found sufficient irregularity in two of Harwick's previous transactions to open a formal investigation. Word of this reached Harwick's primary creditor in Denver, who had been watching the Double M dispute with concern and now moved quickly to protect their own position, calling in two of Harwick's outstanding loans. Harwick arrived at the Double M a second time, but he was a different man from the confident visitor of 2 months earlier. He was tighter around the eyes, his expensive suit slightly less pressed, and his 2 men had been reduced to 1. He spoke to Abel in the yard, and Helen watched from the porch. The conversation was short. Harwick said he was prepared to withdraw his competing water rights claim fully and permanently, in exchange for Abel agreeing not to provide further documentation to the Land Commission. Abel said no. He said it very simply, with the same absolute finality he had used in May, and this time Harwick heard something in it that he had perhaps been choosing not to hear before. He nodded once, a tight, jerked motion, and left. The formal withdrawal of the water rights claim arrived at the county courthouse 3 weeks later. The Land Commission's investigation of Harwick's historical transactions continued independent of anything Abel did or didn't provide, which meant the withdrawal was entirely without the leverage Harwick had hoped for. When the withdrawal document arrived, Abel brought it to Helen's office and set it on her desk. He stood there for a moment looking at it. "It's done," he said. Helen picked up the document and read it through. "It's done," she agreed. He put his hand on her shoulder gently, briefly, with a weight of feeling that his voice didn't carry in that moment but that she felt completely. August settled in hot and golden and full of work that was the good kind, not the crisis kind, the daily accumulation of a ranch in full productive swing. Helen found a rhythm in it that she would not have predicted when she arrived from Cincinnati in the chill of the previous October. She was part of something, part of a place and a purpose, and increasingly, undeniably, part of the life of a man who had let her in slowly and entirely. There was a Sunday afternoon in late August when work was lighter than usual, and Abel had taken her riding, which she had learned from him over the months because there were things about the double M that you could only understand on horseback, the scale of it, the particular quality of the light on the creek in the evening, the way the mountain range behind the valley made a frame that changed with every hour of the day. They rode along the northern boundary in the late afternoon, and Abel showed her the survey stakes from the 1877 mapping, solid and real in the ground, and she put her hand on the top of one of them and felt the specific satisfaction of a thing defended successfully. He was watching her. "What?" she said. "Nothing," but he was almost smiling, which for Abel was equivalent to beaming. "Abel McCrae, you are the least forthcoming person I have ever met in my life." "I know," he said, entirely without apology. She laughed. It surprised him, she could tell, and then it surprised her when he laughed too, quiet and genuine, the laugh of a man who didn't do it often and meant it when he did. She rode home beside him in the long golden light of a Colorado August evening and thought, with a clarity that was almost painful, that she did not want to be anywhere else. That this place, this land, this difficult and wonderful man beside her, this was the thing she had not known she was looking for when she got on the stage in Denver. September arrived, and with it a letter. It was from Hargrove's firm in Cincinnati. Hargrove himself had retired, and his son, a man Helen had met once and found considerably more reasonable than his father, was overhauling the company. He was offering her a position as senior accounts manager, the position that should have been hers years ago, at a salary that was more than double what she currently earned. She sat with the letter at her desk for a long time. She was not a woman who made decisions quickly when the stakes were real. She thought about it for 2 days without telling anyone, which was unusual for her. She had become accustomed to sharing her thinking with Abel. The fact that she couldn't bring herself to tell him about this particular letter was itself information she tried not to read too deeply. The morning of the third day, she packed a bag, not with any clear intention to leave, or perhaps with a half-formed one. She was testing herself, she understood, seeing what the preparation of leaving felt like. It felt terrible. She was sitting on the edge of her bed with the packed bag beside her, looking at the window and the blue Colorado sky and the corner of the barn visible in the distance, when there was a knock at her door. "A moment," she said, and moved the bag to the wardrobe. It was Bertie, the housekeeper, come to say that Abel wanted to see Helen in the study when she had a moment. She went downstairs. Abel was standing by the study window. On the desk behind him was the deed. Helen had not seen it yet. She crossed to the desk and looked at it, and then the whole impossible moment began, the moment that had been the beginning of this story, the document with her name on it, the registrar's stamp. The words Abel McCrae had spoken that had knocked every calculation she had been building out of alignment. "You earned it." She had turned away so he would not see the tears. Now she stood at the study window with her back to him, and the bag was upstairs in the wardrobe, and the letter from Hargrove's son was in her apron pocket, and she was trying to organize her feelings into something navigable. "There's a letter," she said. "All right." His voice was calm. "From my previous employer in Cincinnati. His son, actually, he's offering me a position, senior accounts manager." She took a breath. "At a salary considerably higher than what I earn here." The silence behind her had a particular texture. "I see," Abel said. "I was going to tell you." She turned around. "I was trying to decide what to tell you." He was very still, which was his way, but she could read him now in ways she couldn't in October, and she could see in the set of his shoulders and the exact position of his jaw that this was costing him something. "And," he said, "and then I came downstairs and found that you had given me half your land," she said. "Without asking, without warning." Just she gestured at the desk. "There it is. Yes, Abel, this is your land, your life's work. You built this from nothing." "I built it differently than it is now," he said quietly. "What it is now, what it's become since October, that's built by two people." He was looking at her with that open, serious expression that still undid her every time. "The water rights case, the Harwick situation, the way the accounts are run, the way the buyers correspond with us, the way this ranch operates, that's you. Half of it is genuinely yours. The deed is an acknowledgement of a fact, not a gift." She was quiet. "The letter from Cincinnati," he said. "Do you want that position?" She looked at him. "What I want is not that simple." "Tell me what it is, then." She sat down in the chair across from his desk and put the letter on her knee and looked at it. She was an honest woman. She had always been an honest woman, even when honesty was inconvenient. "I spent 8 years in Cincinnati being good at something and being undervalued for it," she said. "Being passed over and underpaid because I was a woman who knew more than was comfortable for the men around me. I came here to find something different, and I found it. I found work that mattered and that was recognized." She looked up at him. "And then I found you, which I was not expecting and which has complicated everything considerably." He waited. "If I take the position in Cincinnati, I have a career that acknowledges my competence, but I leave here." She touched the deed on the desk. "I leave this, I leave you." She watched his face. "If I stay," she continued, "I stay because of a man, which is exactly the kind of decision I swore I would never make. I swore that my choices would be made for myself, not around a man." Abel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's not what staying would mean." "No, no." He came and sat in the chair beside her rather than behind the desk, which was something, and he leaned forward with his elbows on his knees in the direct, unpretentious way he had. "If you stay, it's because you chose a life that's yours as much as mine. The deed makes that real. It's not about staying because of a man, it's about staying because this is yours." Helen looked at him for a long time. "You thought about this very carefully," she said. "Yes. Before you filed that deed." "Yes." She folded the Cincinnati letter. She looked at it. She thought about 8 years of being excellent and invisible. She thought about the water rights case and the Harwick situation and the Sunday ride along the north boundary in the August light. She thought about a man who had handed her half his life in a document rather than a speech because he communicated in deeds more than in words. She thought about the bag upstairs. "I need to ask you something," she said. "All right. What do you want, Abel? Not what you're offering me. What do you want?" He looked at her steadily. "You." The word was simple and complete and delivered without qualification. She sat with it for a moment. "I want you to marry me," he said, which was the most words he had said in a row in her presence about something personal and which she understood represented a considerable effort. "Not because of the deed. The deed is separate. I want to marry you because you are the most capable and honest and irritatingly perceptive person I have ever known, and because this ranch feels like home when you're in it, and because I have been in love with you since approximately the Colfax letter, and I see no good reason to continue pretending otherwise." Helen Carver pressed her lips together very firmly to maintain her composure, and managed it for approximately 3 seconds before the composure gave way entirely, and she put her face in her hands and laughed, and cried at the same time in the way that only happens when something you've been holding for a very long time finally gets to be put down. Abel sat beside her, patient and solid and not panicked by her emotion, because he had come to understand her well enough to know it was not distress but release, and after a moment he put his arm around her and she leaned into him and the study was quiet around them. "The bag upstairs," she said eventually. "I packed it this morning." "I know," he said. "You knew. Bertie mentioned it when she came to get me." "Bertie," Helen wiped her eyes. "I am going to have complicated feelings about Bertie's loyalty going forward." She likes you, he said. She was worried. Helen sat up and looked at him. I wasn't going to go. I know, he said again, quieter. How do you know? Because you came downstairs. She looked at him. You could have left, he said simply. The stage doesn't run until afternoon. You came downstairs instead. She thought about that. She thought about how well he paid attention, how quietly and completely he noticed things, and she thought about what it meant to be known that thoroughly by someone and to find it not frightening but safe. Yes, she said, I came downstairs. He tucked a strand of her hair back from her face, the gesture so deliberate and gentle that it made her feel like something precious, which was not a feeling she was accustomed to. Is that a yes, Helen? She covered his hand with hers. Yes, she said. That's a yes. They were married in October. 1 year exactly from the day Helen had arrived on the afternoon stage from Denver. The ceremony was held in Millhaven's small church on a bright, cold day that smelled of wood smoke and fallen leaves, with Rufus Bland standing up as Abel's witness, and a woman named Grace Fielding, who ran the town's millinery and had become Helen's closest friend in Millhaven, standing as hers. The church was full. The Double M employed 12 people by that point, and every one of them came, along with neighbors and the banker from Millhaven and Elias, Foot, the attorney, and Judge Crane himself, who had apparently taken a favorable view of the couple since the water rights decision, and considered himself something of a responsible party in their acquaintance. Abel wore his best suit, which Helen had quietly had cleaned and pressed the week before without mentioning it, and he stood at the altar with the particular contained intensity that he brought to everything that mattered to him, and said his vows in a clear, firm voice that left no doubt about the weight he assigned to them. Helen wore a dress of deep blue wool that Grace had helped her choose and her mother's earrings, small garnets that she had carried from Cincinnati in a velvet pouch, and had worn on exactly 3 occasions in the previous years. She said her vows looking directly at Abel and meaning every word with the totality of a woman who did not make promises she didn't intend to keep. When the ceremony was done, and they walked out into the October afternoon to the evident delight of the assembled crowd, Abel took her hand in his, which was the first time he had held her hand in a public and declarative way, and Helen felt the specific, irreplaceable feeling of a life that was exactly what she had chosen. The reception was held at the Double M, and Bertie, whose loyalty Helen had fully forgiven, had organized it with an efficiency that would have been impressive from anyone, and was frankly remarkable from a woman who only came in 3 days a week. There was food in quantities suited to a cattle ranch full of hungry people, and there was dancing to a fiddle player named Amos from 2 ranches over who turned out to have a natural gift, and there was the kind of warmth that comes from a community of people who are genuinely glad about something. Abel danced with her. He was not a natural dancer, which he had warned her about, but he was steady and he paid attention, and he kept his hand firmly at her waist in a way that she found considerably more affecting than technical skill would have been. "You're not terrible," she told him during the second dance. "High praise," he said, with that rare almost smile. "From me, yes." He pulled her slightly closer, which was forward by the standards of public dancing, and which she did not object to even slightly. "Helen McCrae," he said quietly just to say it. She looked up at him. "I rather like the sound of that." "So do I." The almost smile became a real one, brief and complete. "So do I." The winter of 1883 was a working winter like any other, except that it was not like any other at all, because it was their first winter together and everything that had been separately familiar was now shared. Abel's early mornings and long evenings, Helen's lamplit desk work, the rhythm of the ranch around them, constant and reliable as a heartbeat. They disagreed sometimes. Helen was direct and could be formidable when she was certain she was right, and Abel was stubborn in the absolute way of people who do not have a strong habit of being wrong. And there were evenings when the study had a particular charged quality that meant something significant was being negotiated, and neither party was inclined to yield easily. But they had both come from places of being alone too long to be careless with what they had, and the disagreements resolved themselves through the specific and practical act of two honest people working things through, which was the same quality they brought to every other problem on the double M. Spring came, and with it, the news that Helen was expecting. She told Abel in the morning before the ranch day started, at the kitchen table with coffee between them, in the direct way she told him things. She watched his face do something that she had never seen it do before, a kind of silent, total undoing, something moving through him that was too large and too fundamental for his usual containment to hold. He stood up from the table and came around to her and crouched down so he was looking up at her face and took both her hands in his, and for a long moment he said nothing at all. "Abel," she said. "I know," he said, which meant something more than the words in the way it so often did with him. She put her hand on his cheek. He turned and pressed his lips to her palm, which was quiet and tender, and completely undid her in return. Their son was born in November of 1884, healthy and loud, and possessed from his first hours of a quality of absolute determination that everyone who met him in subsequent years would recognize as having been inherited equally from both parents. Abel held him with the careful precision of a large man, handling something he understood to be precious beyond calculation, and the look on his face was the most open Helen had ever seen him. They named him James, after Abel's father. James McCrae grew up on the double M, knowing every inch of the land that would one day partly be his, carried in his parents' arms first, and then toddling through the barn on unsteady legs under Rufus's patient supervision, and then riding along the north boundary on a small pony, while Abel explained the survey stakes and the water rights, and the long history of a place built by two people who had found each other in the middle of a Colorado winter, and decided that was where they were going to stay. A daughter arrived 2 years later, in the late summer of 1886, and they named her Clara after Helen's mother. Clara was, from the start, a child with Helen's precision and Abel's watchfulness, a combination that would in later years make her exactly as formidable as the combination implied. The double M grew steadily through those years. The cattle market had its cycles, the good ones and the difficult ones, and barbed wire came as everyone had predicted it would, changing the open range and requiring new adaptations that Abel made with his characteristic thoroughness. The water rights, secured and defended in the early days of Helen's tenure, proved more valuable with each passing year as the valley grew more settled, and water became more contested. The legal structure Helen had put in place around those rights held. Harwick's operation collapsed in 1885, caught finally in the investigation the Land Commission had been pursuing, and the land he had accumulated was parceled out in a county sale. Abel bought one of the creek-adjacent parcels that shared a fence line with the double M, not out of triumph but out of practicality. It was good land and the price was fair. Helen managed the purchase negotiation herself, which gave her a specific quiet satisfaction. Rufus Bland retired in 1887 with a small severance that Abel insisted on and a standing invitation to Sunday dinners that Rufus accepted regularly for the rest of his years. His replacement as foreman was a young man named Diego Santos, who had come up from New Mexico and who turned out to have exactly the combination of practical skill and quiet reliability that the double M required. By 1888, 6 years after Helen had stepped off the afternoon stage in Millhaven, the double M was the strongest cattle operation in the valley, not the largest but the most soundly structured, which was the kind of strength that lasted when other things didn't. Abel understood land and cattle and people with the instinct of a man born to the work. Helen understood accounts and law and the kind of strategic patience that could see 2 moves ahead of any situation. Together, they were formidable in a way that neither would have been alone. Helen understood this. She thought about it sometimes on the evenings when she was at her desk, and she could hear Abel in the next room going over fence logs with Diego or reviewing the quarterly reports she had prepared, and she thought about the bag she had packed upstairs and the letter in her pocket and the morning she had come downstairs instead of leaving. She had made the right choice. Not because she had stayed for a man, which she had worried about, but because she had stayed for a life that was entirely hers, a life in which her name was on half the deed of a working ranch, and her work was woven into every acre of it, and her children would grow up knowing that their mother had built something real. On a September evening in 1889, Helen was sitting on the porch of the Double M house as the sun went down behind the mountains, watching James and Clara chase each other across the yard in the last of the light. James was 4 and Clara was 2, and they were both at ages where the world was something to be run through at top speed, which they were doing with considerable enthusiasm and not much regard for the chickens. Abel came out and sat beside her, settling into the chair with the easy economy of a man who was home. They watched the children for a while in the comfortable quiet that had always been possible between them, even in the beginning, though it meant different things now. "Do you ever think about Cincinnati?" he asked. Helen considered it. "Sometimes. Less than I used to." "Do you regret it, not taking that position?" She looked at him. It was a genuine question, not an anxious one. He was not a man who asked anxious questions. He asked because he wanted to know the true answer. "No," she said. "Never," he nodded, accepting this as the fact it was. "I want to ask you something," she said. "All right." That morning when you signed the deed before you filed it, she kept her eyes on the children. "What were you thinking?" He was quiet for a moment. "That it was true," he said. "That you had earned it, that the only honest thing to do was to make what was true into something documented." A pause. "And that if you ever thought about leaving, I wanted you to know that this place was yours, not because of me, because of you." She looked at him. "That was your hidden motive," she said. "Yes." He met her gaze without apology. "I suppose it was." "Abel McCrae." She shook her head slowly. "You are the most quietly strategic person I have ever encountered." "I learned from the best," he said. She laughed. He smiled, the full real one that was still, after all this time, a thing she valued precisely because it was rare and because she knew what it meant when she saw it. James ran up to the porch breathless and put both hands on Abel's knees. "Papa, Clara won't stop following me." Abel looked at his son with absolute gravity. "That is what little sisters do." James considered this as a fundamental fact of existence. "Forever, forever," Abel confirmed. James processed this information, sighed with the philosophical resignation of a 4-year-old, and ran back into the yard. Clara, who had been watching the porch conversation with great interest from the yard, toddled after him. Helen rested her head briefly on Abel's shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat on the porch of the Double M Ranch house in the September evening, while their children ran in the last of the golden light, and the mountains turned blue and then purple with the going of the sun. The land stretched out around them, half his by original right and half hers by a deed signed in full knowledge of what it meant. And all of it, every acre, every survey stake, every water right defended and fence line maintained, was the accumulated record of something that had begun with a woman getting off a stage in October and a man who noticed everything but said little, and had grown in the way that the best things grow. Not in a single season, but over years of work and honesty, and the specific, irreplaceable courage of choosing a life that is entirely your own and finding someone to build it with. There was a letter from Hargrove's son on Helen's desk that she had never answered. She had thought about answering it sometimes in the early months when things were uncertain. She thought about it now occasionally, not with regret but with a kind of quiet gratitude for the fact that she had packed a bag and then come downstairs. That was the whole of the story in its simplest form. She had come downstairs, and everything that came from that was real and documented and hers. A third child came in the summer of 1891, another son, whom they named Robert, who arrived into a household that was by then so well established and so filled with the particular energy of 2 working parents and 2 older children that he learned to be easygoing about noise and activity, and was the most good-natured of the 3 McCrae children by a considerable margin. Abel turned 40 that year, and did not seem to notice it particularly, which was entirely in character. Helen made him a cake, which Bertie assisted with and which James attempted to help with, and which was consequently somewhat lopsided but tasted entirely right. The cattle industry was changing around them through the early 1890s, the great open-range era giving way to more settled, more fenced, more regularized patterns of ranching, and the double M adapted with them. Helen modernized the accounting systems again as new tools became available, and Abel studied the changing market structures with the same methodical attention he brought to everything, and adjusted the operations focus in ways that proved, over the following decade, to have been exactly right. The water rights, those carefully defended, expensively maintained water rights, became by the mid-1890s the single most significant asset of the operation, as the valley continued to grow and water became what everyone who understood the land had always known it would become, the essential thing. The value of the double M increased substantially through this period, and Abel, reviewing the most recent assessment with Helen one evening in the office, said with characteristic understatement, "Your instincts about Harwick were worth more than I understood at the time." "They were your instincts too," she said. "You told him no. You gave me the information to know that no was the right answer." She looked at him over the ledger. "We've been doing this for years, this conversation." "What conversation?" "The one where you give me credit and I give it back to you and we go in circles." He almost smiled. "It's a good conversation." "It is," she agreed. She went back to the ledger and he stayed where he was, leaning against the bookcase in the way he did sometimes when he was thinking, and after a moment he said, "Are you happy, Helen?" The question was simple and entirely like him, without preamble or context, just the direct core of what he wanted to know. She set down her pen. She thought about it with the honesty she always brought to his direct questions. "Yes," she said, "completely." He nodded once, satisfied, and straightened up from the bookcase. "Good," he said. It was enough. From Abel McCrae, it was the equivalent of a long and eloquent declaration, and she knew it completely and loved him for it in a way that had only deepened and grown more specific with time. James grew up to love the land the way his father did, with a practical, devoted intensity that made his future clear early. He was 15 by the time the century turned, and already riding alongside Abel on the full operations of the double M, learning everything with a concentration that Abel recognized and trusted. Clara had Helen's inclination toward precision and her father's stubbornness, and by 15 she was already talking about the law in a way that made Elia's foot, still practicing in Millhaven at a considerably advanced age, take notice. Helen encouraged this with complete sincerity, and without any attempt to redirect it toward more conventional female ambitions, because she was not a woman who had any patience for that kind of redirection. Robert was the surprising one, the easygoing third child who turned out to have a precise and unusual gift for understanding animals, particularly horses, in a way that neither of his parents could fully explain, but which made him invaluable on the ranch in ways that were different from but complementary to his older brother's gifts. The McCrae ranch house grew with them, rooms added as the family needed them, always with Helen's practical eye for what was necessary and Abel's competent hands in the building. The office that had been Helen's from the beginning was still hers, though the ledgers it held now documented 3 decades of a shared operation rather than the first tentative months of a professional engagement that had become, through honesty and courage and a considerable amount of hard work, something neither of them had planned and both of them had chosen. On the morning of their 20th anniversary, Abel came into the office where Helen was working and put a second document on her desk. She looked up. It was a new deed, an updated one. Her name first now by alphabetical order or by Abel's deliberate choice, she suspected the latter. She looked at him. "It needed updating," he said. "New parcels, your name should be first." She looked at the deed. 20 years of the double M's history, 20 years of two people building something together, documented in ink and filed at the county courthouse in Millhaven. "You didn't ask me," she said. No, his voice had the same quality it had had 20 years ago when he said the same thing in the same study. "You earned it." She stood up from her desk and walked around it and put her arms around him, and he held her with the particular completeness of a man who had been doing it for 20 years and intended to do it for 20 more. "I love you," she said. "Which I want it noted I say considerably more often than you do. I know," he pressed his lips to her temple. "I'm working on it. You've been working on it for 20 years. I'm a slow worker." She laughed against his shoulder. Outside the office window, the double M spread in all directions under the morning sky. The fenced pastures and the creekside meadows and the barns and the bunkhouse and the outbuildings of a working ranch that had grown through 2 decades from a solid single-man operation into something larger and more various and more rooted in the land than it had ever been. The cattle grazed in the south pasture. Somewhere in the direction of the horse barn, Robert was doing whatever Robert did with horses that resulted in them doing exactly what he wanted them to. James's voice carried from somewhere near the north fence. Clara was in Denver, in her second year of reading law in the office of a patient attorney who had been persuaded to take her on after receiving a letter from Helen that had, everyone who heard about it agreed, been difficult to say no to. Abel kept his arms around Helen and looked out the window at the land. She kept her face against his shoulder and felt the specific, accumulated weight of a life that was entirely hers, built on ground she had earned in the most literal sense, surrounded by children they had made together, in a place she had chosen with both eyes open on a Colorado morning 20 years ago when she had packed a bag and then come downstairs instead. "Are you happy?" he asked. The same question he had been asking for 20 years, with the same directness, wanting the same honest answer. She looked up at him. "Yes," she said, "completely." He nodded, satisfied the way he always was, and held her a moment longer before the demands of the morning required them both, as they always did on the double M, to be somewhere specific and doing something purposeful. But for that moment, they stood in the office where it had all been decided, with the deed on the desk and the land outside the window and the life they had built between them present in every particular of the place, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.